Okay. And now we have them loaded, and also a welcome to people who are live streaming. We now have cut a little bit into our time, and if any of you have been to these panels before, you know that one of the things that we love to do is to leave lots of time for conversation. And so we're holding the speakers to a 8-minute limit, which they're very accustomed to. But it's not something that professors are typically accustomed to, which is only talking for a very short time. But without further ado, I just want to introduce you all at once to the members of this panel so that I don't have to take time in between and introduce them. All right? So I'm going to start with the more seasoned professionals at the far end of the table and work my way to the rising stars of the new generation. I'll start with myself, probably the most, or one of the most seasoned professionals in the room. I'm Professor Jean Rhodes, and I am the director of the Center for Evidence-Based Mentoring, which is a collaboration between UMass Boston and Mentor, and professor of psychology. And I also just want to put in a pitch, if you guys are interested in research and you don't know, there's the Chronicle of Evidence-Based Mentoring that you can get updates, as well as David's listserv. So there's lots of opportunities in between these sessions to learn more about the research in the field. At the far end is Dr. Janice Coopersmith, a child clinical psychologist who is the president and senior researcher at IRT, Innovation Research and Training, and has developed, her and her team have developed evidence-based mentor training, and you can ask her about that later, or you go to the IRT booth. There's Professor David Dubois from the University of Illinois in Chicago, who probably you all know. He's well known in the field of youth mentoring, has published many, many studies on its effects, and is going to be presenting some of that. Dr. Professor Michael Karcher from the University of Texas, San Antonio. And again, very delighted to have you here. And then Dr. Elizabeth Raposa, a rising star who you'll hear more from in the coming years. And we welcome her into our field of researchers. As well as Dr. Lindsay Wheeler, who is at the University of Minnesota and doing some really terrific cutting-edge research. I should say that Dr. Elizabeth Raposa is currently a postdoc, a MacArthur Foundation postdoc working with me, but will be taking over as assistant professor at William & Mary starting in the fall. Okay, well, thank you, everybody. And without further ado, David, why don't you get started?
Okay.
I set an 8-minute timer, and I looked at the different choices for ringtones, and one of them was Summit, so I picked that one. So,
Okay.
so I think you can just stay where you are, but use the microphone.
Certainly. Okay. Okay.
Wow, pretty cool.
Well. First test passed. Okay. Now, Michael was pointing out that he thinks this could be last year's slide deck. So if it is, I'm ready to improvise.
Oh, yeah, Heather's on there.
Yeah.
It doesn't look correct.
So while we are figuring that out, let's see, targeted research.
Yeah, I don't think that's...
All
Yeah.
right, that's interesting.
But that's okay. So what I'm going to talk to you today about is research that I did in collaboration with the whole wonderful team. Tom Keller at Portland State as a partner in crime on the research side, and Big Brothers Big Sisters, both the national office and 10 affiliates around the country, and with support from OJJDP funding. And the thrust of the research was the question of, can we enhance the impact? So we all know and have good, very strong scientific and otherwise reasons to believe exist in the kinds of programming that, services that programs like Big Brothers Big Sisters offer. So we did what's called a randomized controlled trial, but unlike the ones you might be most used to, where you flip a coin proverbially and half don't get services and half get some program. In this case, the half that were the, quote, control group, really a comparison group, received Big Brothers Big Sisters community-based mentoring as usual. And then the treatment or intervention group received those services with supports for youth thriving integrated into the services. What do I mean by integration? beginning with staff training around the framework that we're using, which is the Step It Up to Thrive framework of the Thrive Foundation for Youth. If you haven't visited their Step It Up to Thrive Resource Center, and if you ping me on an email, I can get you to it, but if you Google, you'll don't do that now, please. I'm just teasing. These are downloadable, free resources. We took those. They're already designed for adult guides to use with youth, but we further worked with those and BBBS agencies, some pre-piloting, and tried to really meld them as much as possible into their service delivery model. So there was staff training, and then there was training for mentors in this Step It Up to Thrive framework, and then as they went about their relationships with youth, they were their littles, they were asked to come to at least a couple different sessions, both around Sparks development and growth mindset development, and then later around thriving indicators, the 6 C's for positive youth development: connection, competence, confidence, character, contribution. How are you doing on those? How am I doing on those as a mentor? Where are some ways that we can work together to build on your strengths and to foster your further growth in other areas, which I personally love, because I'm just basic principle that none of us are finished products. And then finally, now that you kind of have identified with me and we've begun to explore some of your interests, and you have this really great sense of a growth mindset, I can grow my abilities with effort and persistence, and I kind of know a little bit more about myself and what I bring to the table. What are some very particular goals that you want to accomplish that are meaningful for you, that are going to be good for your future and so forth? And let's really get into working on those, not just setting them, but pursuing them. And there's an emerging science of goal pursuit, not just from the youth field, but from others in terms of business and so forth, where, of course, goals are important as well, right? So that's those. In addition to those workshops, the Match support staff were trained up on providing ongoing coaching around those concepts. And it's called the Thriving Journey. You can see that kind of, if we get a slide up there, you'll see it. But oh, it is wonderful. There we go. And this is this kind of 4-step process, right? That is the basic idea. And this really comes out of a really about as rock hard a foundation as you get in the social sciences of different folks' research. Carol Dweck's research around growth mindset, the late Peter Benson's around Sparks, Rich Lerner and many others around those 6 C's, and again the Lerner group around goals, as well as a number of other folks. So, long story short, because I'm probably already at 5-6 minutes, no differences. After 800 youth, around 10 agencies, 15-month follow-up. Are they reporting more thriving on these indicators? Yeah, I have a spark. I pursue it actively. I have this growth mindset. I'm feeling really good about my 6 C's, and I have this knowledge about how to set goals. I'm doing better in my behavior in different contexts, because Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, so it was one of our first places to look. Then we took a hard look at our implementation data, knowing that we had just a number of challenges, and not to lay at the doorstep of the agencies, but it was our learning along the way of how to make this a good fit within a mentoring, a volunteer-based mentoring program, where I think there was always that tension of folks like, well, that sounds really good, and that sure, and then they feel like, whoa, now I'm feeling like I'm being made a paraprofessional counselor here, and not necessarily really feeling the confidence or seeing the value in doing that. So there was a lot of challenges. So about 40% got about half of the activities and the kinds of supports and the mentor training. So looking at that half, we went over to the control group and said, let's find otherwise similar people that look like they would have been those youth to get, to kind of do apples and apples, right? Because the youth who engaged with their mentors might be selective, right? So we went to the control group and tried to find a really similar group at the beginning. And then and these will, I think, all be available for you, so I won't go through that. But that's the kind of 15-month process of those activities I was trying to articulate. So this is the model we fit, and it's essentially a theory of change, which seems to be the buzzword of the current times. So this is our theory of change. And it's like, well, it doesn't look all that impressive. Well, when you really get to fitting things with statistics, you can only get so complex. It kind of forces you to be a little bit parsimonious. So you see here, positive engagement with Step It Up to Thrive activities. So that's that 40% in the treatment group versus a matched 40% of the control group who looked like they would have engaged positively with Thrive if that coin had flipped and they would have gotten that opportunity. They reported more adult support for thriving. You may say, duh, but it's the first step in a theory of change. And we didn't ask from a mentor. We said, adults in your life, do they help you, all those things? Find your interest and pursue them. Cultivate a sense of your abilities and that they can grow. Setting goals and supporting you. So they were saying, yes. And these are all controlling for baseline. So these are improvements in that adult support for thriving. That, in turn, predicted improvements in your actual thriving indicators, those 4 areas, which in turn predicted a reduction in youth problem behavior as indicated both by more kind of pre-delinquent behaviors and delinquency. And that is a story that thriving looks promising, but implementation is key. And we'll join you for update on this story next year. And I have to leave. Thank you.
A big thank you also for the improv, David. We really appreciate it. And now our technical glitches are over. And if you could just advance to the next slide.
Okay. And my apologies, but I'm double booked.
Oh, can you go back one?
Yes, I'm
Yeah.
double booked and going to have to exit here shortly. I apologize.
That's fine. All right. We understood.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Jean. Do we read our own news, or we just leave it up?
You can
Okay.
you can read the headline and then move on to the topic. Would you like me to
I
read it?
may read it.
Oh,
I can read
longitudinal
it.
follow-ups on students in a randomized study of school-based mentoring in communities and schools program revealed lower criminality and higher rates of pursuing post-secondary education for some Latino and Latina mentees 10 years later. Wow, that's impressive.
I know, it's a little freaky. Let's see, do I have a little slide of those people? No, it's hidden. Okay. First, I want to thank the William T. Grant Foundation and the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention for funding the 2 studies that allowed us to track 525 kids from 2004 to 2015. We enrolled 2 waves of kids in a study. There were 525. Ultimately, we had 468. We divided those by half, randomly assigned them to receive a mentor in the Communities and Schools program, in addition to different sorts of support services provided to all kids then through the program, or to just receive those services. It's an interesting comparison group because I don't think the comparison kids knew they were comparison kids because they all got services, and so it's kind of a nice one. None of what we call resentful demoralization from being put on a wait list. In 2008, we published the findings which showed positive and negative effects. They were a bit equivocal. The positive effects were for the youngest, the strongest were for the youngest boys who had improvements in connectedness to school. And for the whole sample, there was a main effect on improved self-esteem and some other outcomes. But one of the problems was that the high school boys got worse. They declined on every measure, and they were significantly less likely to they were significantly less connected to their teachers after having a mentor. And we went and looked at some of the activities to try to figure out what was going on, because we tracked what they did every week. And it was out of that work that I started to really become fascinated by whether matches should be playing or talking or learning or doing homework. So basically that sample was all in place by 2005. And in 2015, we followed up with them. And we used criminal records. We got them for, well, it's hard to know, but we think we got them for everybody because we did pretty exhaustive searches and looked at whether they'd committed any criminality, specifically any misdemeanors. And then we also looked to see if they had enrolled in any form of post-secondary education. Could be junior college, could be college, could even be a trade school. And I'm still playing with the findings because I can't believe them that there's a there is a increased likelihood of going to college, seeking some post-secondary, having received this mentoring experience, and less likely to commit criminality. The biggest, most clear impacts were for the high school boys, and they are clearly less likely. I think they're 3 times less likely to have engaged in criminal activity. And then it was the young girls who were most likely to pursue, they were 2.5 times more likely to pursue some form of post-secondary education. A little mind-blowing, and we've looked at all sort of what we call random effects and all kinds of covariates to try to figure this out, to see if it'll go away. I was a little nervous about today because I don't want to have to defend this stuff, but it's really sort of unbelievable. Additionally, sort of unbelievable, I thought, well, let me see if any of the changes that we observed from pre to post are related to crime, right? We'd think, well, is any change on the stuff we reported, and I'll be damned, changes in self-esteem, changes in school connectedness, these outcomes we measured during the course of that year for the mentees predicts their rates of criminality in particular. That's great. I know, and so when I first started giving these findings, I was a little concerned about how to present them because I was coming up with fun titles like Jean does for her talks and Renee does on her papers, you know, like Swift Kick in the Pants or a wake-up call. Because one of the problems that I saw after the 2008 study came out and I was looking at things was that the high school boys in particular, but the high school kids in general, got so much more talking to about grades, attendance, behavior, so much more work on homework. And the more that they got, the less valued they felt by their mentors. And that for me was sufficient evidence to say we're not doing mentoring right in the high schools. And a lot of anecdotal and even some qualitative evidence that the main issue there was that these mentors were coming in to work with, let's say, high school boys, Latino boys, in the high schools. There were no places to get to or go away from, so they would meet in the cafeteria. These kids were close to being at risk. Keep seeing Donovan, want to say hi. They were close to dropping out. They were much closer than the younger kids, so I think the threat was imminent. So here's this mentor coming and sitting with you at lunch and talking about all you're doing wrong. I mean, it made sense to me why there was no, why they weren't feeling valued. But here they were the ones who benefited, so I thought, what the heck? This is not consistent with what I've been telling people for the last 8 years, and even locally at communities and schools, they sort of reduced the number of high school kids they provided mentors, and we even created another program altogether for the kids. It's a workplace mentoring program. So I've had to go back and say, sorry, you were right, I was wrong. You were doing it quite well. So I kept thinking, and well, that's a real shame. So then I actually went back and looked at, before this, looked at those activities again to see what they did and if it predicted outcomes. Again, not thinking I would find anything. I swear I'll lay out my data, you guys can look at it. It turns out that even though those high school kids in general got 2 or 3 times as much of this problem focus, consistently across grades and across sexes, what predicted of what they did in the match, what predicted outcomes, the greater likelihood of seeking post-secondary, but largely lower rates of criminality, was what we call developmental talking, talking about friends, talking about family, this sort of friendship sort of conversation. And the next was play. These conversations about the problem, they were associated with problem relationship then, and they're also associated with more criminality down the road. Wow. So at least I didn't screw that one up. I thought I had for a year. It's been a little depressing. So I'm excited about this, and I will say one of the other things that sort of blew my mind was that I really have some, Dave, I really don't believe this, but it's there. Most of the measures of relationship quality predicted our outcomes. They predicted engaging in criminal activity. I mean, I'm controlling for all kinds of baseline characteristics of kids, even the ratings by parents, by teachers, by the mentors themselves. I don't get it. And one of the grant was funded to see if feeling that you mattered to your mentors, this construct 15 years ago that was of interest that hadn't got much play, that was the main construct. Well, it turns out that scale, mattering to my mentor is the strongest predictor of all of the relationship quality. And I also hate to say this because I don't like this, but it turns out the more meetings, the bigger the increases in post-secondary pursuit and reductions in criminal engagement. But I do want to say this isn't over multiple years. It's school-based mentoring, and it's 1 year, meaning the more times you can get boots on the ground, the better. It just does not at all mean you need to have multiple year matches. I'm a strong proponent of wrapping matches up at the end of the year. Write that one down. So the last thing, can I make 2 more points just real quick? One is we use this measure where we ask the kids to write down who were the people in their lives at the end of the year who were non-family members who were supportive and cared for them and were available. And those kids who nominated their mentors, specifically who were more likely to pursue post-secondary education. And the last thing I want to share that's with you, that I think is relevant to you, staff support, staff resources, staff availability was important. And I will say it was most important for the girls, and it had it was one of the more useful predictors of pursuit of post-secondary. So there clearly, from this data, is important. It's an important role of the program in outcomes. And then the weirdest one is mentor efficacy, and that's obviously promoted by effective training. Why mentor efficacy? Why a mentor's report of how effective they feel in being a mentor would contribute to real outcomes down the road blows my mind. But I think it's all about the way.
It always does. It always does.
I've just never seen it. So I'm excited about the findings and a little scared, and glad to share them with you today.
Thank you, Mike.
Awesome. Wonderful work. Teaching an award for that work. That is fabulous. It's so great that you did that for us.
I don't, that's not me.
Okay,
Oh,
that's
this
my.
is,
Oh, Janice. Janice. You're
Oh,
up.
I'm just like kvelling about how much I love his paper. Hi. Actually, this paper is a great follow-up to what Michael just presented, and it's a little bit more granular, but not as well, less granular, I guess. More.
Do you want me to read the headline? Or?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay. Both mentor and mentee reports of match quality predict youth outcomes for children of incarcerated parents and the general population of mentor youth.
Great, thanks. So, so in this paper, we were particularly interested in children who have an incarcerated parent. And, you know, they're not very well studied actually in the academic literature, but there's a lot of interest, a lot of public interest, and a lot of governmental interest in that population. The little bit that we know is that they're a vulnerable group. They are high risk. Parental arrest and imprisonment can have devastating effects on children. In fact, one study suggested that up to 30% of children who have an incarcerated parent suffer from mental health problems, compared to 10% of the general population. So they're, you know, 3 times as likely to have a problem like depression, anxiety, sleep and eating problems, substance abuse, aggression, truancy, and poor school grades. They're 7 times more likely to be involved in the juvenile justice system and six times more likely to be incarcerated. So it's a very high-risk population, and it's also pretty prevalent. About 2 million kids, you know, fit that population. So when children face the stress and trauma of having a parent arrested or incarcerated, having an enduring positive mentoring relationship can be a crucial protective factor, providing them with stability and support. One thing we know from, you know, Jean's work and now very excitingly Michael's work is that not all relationships are the same. Research suggests that the match quality is very important for achieving youth outcomes. And quality is often thought of in a couple ways in terms of match length and match strength, and maybe now match frequency of meeting, the density of meetings. And that most of the time that's been examined from the perspective of the mentee. So that the quality of the relationship is really thought of as how does the mentee feel about that relationship and how does that predict youth outcomes. It's interesting that in a recent paper by Jean and Sarah Schwartz, I think I might have seen Sarah here.
Yeah.
Yay, hi. And some colleagues, they did some interesting work examining the mentor's perception of the relationship and asking the question, can we assess it in a meaningful way? And is it related to what the mentee says? Like, do they agree? And then does it predict early match closure? And both of those things are true. They're modestly related, so what the mentee says is modestly related to what the mentor says, but that's not the same. They have different views of the relationship, But what the mentor says is related to the length of the match. And we know that length of match can be important, and in other research it is associated with outcomes for youth, particularly if the match closes prematurely. So we were interested in those questions relevant to children of incarcerated parents. In other words, we know that the quality of the relationship mediates match outcomes for kids in general, but does it also for a high-risk population? People haven't really studied high-risk populations necessarily as much in terms of what is it about mentoring that works for them. So we asked two questions. Does match closeness from the perspective of both the mentor and the mentee predict youth outcomes? In other words, do you need to know how the mentor feels about the relationship in order to get a full picture of outcomes for youth? Or do you just need to know what the mentee feels? Like, does it add to the prediction? And then is it equally as important in a high-risk population, like children who have an incarcerated parent, as it is for the general population? And I'll just show you, whoops, oh shoot. Okay, so I did a cute little picture. If you've taken our training, you know we have our big I and little I representing a mentor and a mentee. And so Katie, who's in the room, did this with Rebecca Stelter and Dr. Katie Stump and Jean. We also have a grant from the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, and we were fortunate through that grant to work in collaboration with Big Brother, Big Sister of America to have access to the AIM data set. AIM is a unique and proprietary data set that tracks and evaluates matches between volunteers and youth. It's used in over 200 agencies, and we have that data, the set of the data from 2008 to 2015. 3 minutes with 192 agencies, over 12,000 kids in the data set who are in the general population, and over 3,000 who have a parent who's in prison. So again, cut to the chase, controlling for lots of different factors. The question is, does the strength of the relationship was reported by the mentor, who's the gray, and the mentee, who's the little red eye, predict outcomes? And we looked at 4 outcomes, and the answer is yes. If you have both in the model, if you can look at both individually and then both in the model, it's really important to get the perspective of both the mentor and mentee in understanding youth outcomes. And they both predict to peer relations in terms of social acceptance, as well as the relationship with parents in terms of parent trust. I will say that the magnitude of the impact is small, but it's controlling for a lot of things in the model. And it also predicts to school outcomes. So both predict to grades. However, it's only what the mentee thinks that predicts to attendance. The mentor did not add to the prediction in a meaningful way. One conclusion is that the quality of the relationship does predict relationship duration. We also know that. And we also know that the quality of the relationship from the perspective of the mentor and the mentee add to the prediction for outcomes. And being a child of an incarcerated parent does not moderate it. So the relationship is equally as important for both populations. Both perspectives add. In terms of next steps, we are looking at, within that sample, we have 50 agencies where we've collected data on how they do training and the practices that they engage in. Of course, they're all Big Brother, Big Sister agencies, so the range of differences in practices are not great, but there is actually some diversity, and we're going to be looking at that diversity. We've interviewed program directors, and we're looking at the implementation of evidence-based practices to see if that also helps us in terms of understanding what they do differently in serving this high-risk population, and also how that is related to outcomes. And then Jean is the principal investigator of a very large evaluation grant that we're doing in collaboration with many, and I see Susan's in the room in the back, Many is implementing a wide array of enhancements for 20 mentoring programs who serve this population. 1,440 matches are randomly assigned to get the enhancements or get mentoring as usual. So a very stringent test to see if we can improve the quality of outcomes for this population by providing enhanced practices. And we're working in collaboration with Jean at UMass Boston in doing the evaluation of that. So we're trying to extend our work and trying to, now we know something about match quality and doing some more research on what predicts that, and then trying to do a kind of experimental test. So thank you.
Yeah, and 10 seconds to spare.
Wow. Talking fast.
Right. So, next up.
Yes. So I am going to be talking about youth living in stressful contexts and how that tends to impact the strength and quality of their mentoring relationships, and whether there are any qualities of the mentor that can help to buffer against that negative impact. So the drive behind this study was really to figure out how to optimize mentoring outcomes for youth who are experiencing more than usual environmental stress. And that might be in their family context, in the neighborhood that they live in, it might be at school with their peers or with their teachers. And a lot of studies don't look directly at how the context that kids are coming from affect their outcomes, and the ones that do tend to have kind of mixed findings. So some studies really show or suggest kind of that mentoring is really well suited to work with kids who are coming from stressful contexts, and that in fact if you don't have any stress in your life, mentoring really isn't an appropriate intervention to assign. And then other studies show that with increasing environmental stress, it can kind of overwhelm the mentoring relationship and lead to poor outcomes, early termination, things like that. And so our first goal was just to see how does stress impact the strength and quality of mentoring relationships. And we used a sample of 565 youth, and they were all part of Big Brother, Big Sister school-based mentoring programs. So they were meeting with their mentors through their schools. And they reported on their stressors at baseline, and then we followed them for a year and looked at their mentoring outcomes. So the stress measure that we used was a checklist of 14 different stressors that could be occurring in their family, in their schools. I have a couple of examples up here of the stressors that we looked at. So it could be a parent who lost a job or lost their work, a parent who had a history of incarceration, being victimized at school, loss of a friend or family member to death, to passing away. And so kids reported on these, and in our sample, in general, people had moderate levels of stress. So on average, kids were reporting about 6 of these stressors. So it wasn't a low stress group in general. And then we followed them up for a year, and we looked at how long their mentoring relationships last. So how strong were they? If they were higher quality, we presume that they would last the full year. And we found that in our sample, with each increasing stressor, there was a higher likelihood of earlier termination. So more stressors led to fewer days within the match, and it seemed to be having this negative influence kind of linearly. So with each new stressor, there was a higher risk of losing days on your match. And so our next question was, were there certain mentors who could buffer against this negative impact? Might there be people who are just really good at dealing with kids who come from high stress environments? And we looked at a couple of different mentor characteristics at baseline. One was, what was the mentor's goal coming into this relationship? Kind of like Michael was talking about, did they have this developmental goal where they wanted to be friends with the kid, they wanted to talk to them about their relationship between the mentor and the mentee? Or did they have a more instrumental goal? Like, I want to come in and help this kid do better in school. I want to help them get better grades. We also looked at mentors' previous involvement with youth in a variety of contexts, both formal, so had they been involved in something like Big Brothers, Big Sisters before, and informal. So were they interacting with youth in their communities through a variety of other kind of more informal settings? Did they tutor at a local school? Did they tend to donate to youth programs? Had they worked for Girl Scouts, Boy Scouts, things like that? We also looked at mentors' general attitudes towards youth. So did they tend to see them as troublemakers in the community, or did they tend to hold more positive attitudes towards the youth in their community? And then finally, we looked at this kind of catch-all of mentor self-efficacy. So at baseline, coming in before they'd ever met their mentee, how confident was the mentor that they were going to be able to do a good job with this mentee? And so we found when we looked at interactions between these mentor characteristics and the youth's stressful context, that 2 of these played a really important role in buffering against this negative impact of stress. So first, mentor self-efficacy. You can see this in the left graph. The dotted line is people with lower than average self-efficacy as a mentor coming in. They tended to have this really strong relationship between more stress. My kid is coming from a more stressful background. Our relationship is going to tend to end earlier. But if you look at the solid line, mentors who came in with higher than average self-efficacy, there was no relationship between stress and the length of the relationship. They were kind of dealing with these stressors as they came up, and they weren't tending to have this problem of early termination. And then you can see on the right that mentors' previous involvement with youth through informal contexts was another one of these buffers. So for the dotted line, mentors who in general hadn't had as much contact with youth through kind of these informal community settings tended to show that strong relationship between environmental stressors in the kid's life and ending the relationship earlier. But for that solid line, people who had had a lot of contact with kids from a variety of backgrounds, who had worked with these kids in a number of settings, they tended to have no relationship between stress and the outcomes. And one thing that we thought was really interesting was that we didn't see the same relationship for mentors who had previous formal mentoring. And in fact, mentors who came in with formal mentoring experience through something like Big Brothers Big Sisters, their mentees actually reported more dissatisfaction with the relationship. And we think that this has a lot to do with expectations that mentors might have coming in. So some mentors who had a really positive experience with Big Brothers Big Sisters, they're coming back for a second time, they might expect to have that same quick connection with the youth that they're being paired with. And if the kid's coming from a really stressful background, it might be a lot harder this time to make that connection. And so they're having more trouble connecting with the youth. Whereas if you've had a lot of contact with youth in informal settings, you tend to be a little bit more familiar with some of the stressors that might be coming up in their lives and to know how to deal with those when they come up. So our bottom line here, what we're drawing from this is that the context that youth are coming from really impact how strong and how long-lasting their mentoring relationships are, which in turn can really affect how much they're getting out of mentoring. But there are certain mentor characteristics that we can look for in order to improve their outcomes. And we think this has a lot of implications for matching, but it also has a lot of implications for training. So if there are ways that we can expose mentors to various scenarios that might come up commonly with kids who live in really stressful backgrounds, and if we can train them in some appropriate responses to those sorts of things, how to talk to the kid's family, how to interface with the kid's school if it's a really stressful environment for them, then we can increase their self-efficacy around these types of issues and perhaps kind of eliminate the negative relationship that we see between stress and the shorter mentoring relationship.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And with 30 seconds to And just again, we're going to have opportunities to discuss all of these exciting findings after Lindsay's presentation.
Oh, sure.
A new study suggests the impact of mentoring on maltreated children differs by children's relational histories.
Great, thank you. I always really enjoy coming to this and speaking on this panel because I am learning about all of the new great work that people are doing ahead of time before it, comes to the journals where we read about them. So I'm really excited to be here. My interest is really in marginalized youth populations and understanding mentoring conditions that are best attuned for those populations. So youth in foster care, youth in juvenile justice, homeless youth. I'm happy to hear that Janice is doing some work around children of incarcerated parents, and really interested in what Liz just talked about as well, of thinking about the role of risk and the role of stress in the lives of children that we're mentoring. So I'm going to talk today about maltreated children that are involved in a mentoring program called Fostering Healthy Futures that Dr. Heather Taussig, who's not here at this conference, developed, that is for 9 to 11-year-olds who are in foster care due to maltreatment. So this study, just a little bit of background. So we all know this, if you've worked with maltreated children before, that those who are maltreated compared to their non-maltreated peers are more likely to have insecure attachments, that their relationships are more distressful, that there's feelings of abandonment that make forming a mentoring relationship more difficult. So there's some research that says that, in fact, youth who have been maltreated and youth in foster care really benefit from mentoring. And then there's other cautions to working with children who have been maltreated in terms of thinking clearly and thoughtfully and meaningfully about the relationships that are forming and really training mentors to be sensitive to the unique issues of traumatized children. So So in one study, this was not with youth in foster care exclusively, that Sarah Schwartz and Jean and some of their colleagues did, looked at the role of relationship histories in determining whether children would benefit from mentoring. So when children came into the program, this is a school-based program, when they came in with satisfactory relationships or adequate relationships, they seemed to benefit more than those youth who came into the program with strong or weak relationships. So there was sort of a sweet spot that they found in terms of those children gleaning the most benefit. So we wanted to see for maltreated children who presumably have more distressful relationship histories coming into programs if this pattern held true. So did the impact of this Fostering Healthy Futures program differ by the types of relationship histories that, of youth coming into the program? Oh, this thing is touchy. Okay. So before we did that, we wanted to see what types of relationships youth were coming into. So we did what was called the latent profile analysis to see if there were groups of youth in our sample that would help us discern whether there were even different types of relationships. And in Sarah's paper, they looked at relationships with peers, caregivers, and teachers. Again, it was school-based mentoring. And here we looked at relationships with biological parents. So none of the children at this time in the study were living with their biological parents, but presumably they still had feelings about their relationships with their biological parents. Relationships with substitute caregivers, so this could be a foster parent, a grandparent, a group home leader, whoever they were living with and who was caring for them at the time, and then peers. And what we found that relative to the rest of the children in our sample, we had this group, which is the blue line, the very top line, that we are calling our strong group, that they had relatively strong relationships in each of those three groups. They had relatively positive views of their biological parents, their substitute caregivers, and positive relationships with peers. So one thing here, just to keep in mind that this is relative to the sample. So this isn't to say that the strong group in our maltreated sample is the same as the strong group in Sarah's sample. So this isn't a direct comparison, but we do have this group that seems to be doing pretty well in relationships. Then we have this green group, which is the line just below the blue one that we're calling an adequate relationship group, where their relationships seem to be relatively stable across the three groups, but just a little bit less or a little bit weaker than that strong group. And then our final group we're calling disrupted. So they have about the same types of relationships to the adequate group for substitute caregivers and peers, but their relationships with their biological parents are a lot weaker. So we're calling this disrupted for reasons that you can see on the graph. So we took those three groups, and this was a randomized controlled trial of about 425 children, and we wanted to see whether the impact of the program on mental health, so here we're interested in mental health outcomes, differed by these three groups. And what you can see, looking at mental health problems, post-traumatic stress and dissociation, so really those trauma-related symptoms, we see the strongest effects for our adequate group. So it's mirroring, at least, the pattern that Sarah and others found in their study. Again, not a direct comparison, but that those in the adequate group coming into the program with not strong but not disrupted relationships seems to do better. So bottom line, I said the first part of it, but the second piece of it are some of the implications that those in the strong or the disrupted group, we need to be thinking about those groups. Whether that's additional intervention or alternative intervention, or for the strong group, I suppose one implication would be no intervention. And I think we want to just really think critically about who we're targeting and for whom mentoring is most effective, particularly for this really highly vulnerable, traumatized group of children.
Very good, thank you. All right, now we're going to, let me just turn off my timer real quick. Now we're going to open it up to questions and comments. I'm sure many of you have questions. Before we do, I thought it might be helpful to just kind of summarize. There's some real consistency across the speakers here. And I think if I had a choice, I would have renamed this panel the role of risk, because you see everybody is looking at higher than average risk populations and looking at what matters. So what matters for the relationship? Well, one thing that we learn, which is fascinating, I can't wait to see how Michael writes it up, is that even if we don't get great effects immediately when we do our evaluations, there seems to be some sleeper effects here, right? You go back years later, and what looked like it might be problematic or not a very strong effect turns out to be something that could be life transformative. You're going to school and you're getting involved in less criminality. That's powerful. So we should take, there's often researchers are the bearers of really bad news. And I think in this case, we can really embrace the idea that weak effects now don't mean weak effects later. In fact, they could be very powerful things that you lay down that aren't manifest right away. But as David's talk showed, it really depends. It depends on the implementation of the program. And what he found was really, really important. And that is if you go in and you just try to change someone, and you've got this very structured thing and you're not implementing it consistently, you're not going to have strong effects. But I think the other thing that we see is that we really need to say that the person who's the mentor and the person who's the youth matter, that we need to understand them because we're going to have different effects for young people coming in who are either mentoring high-risk youth or are high-risk youth. One that Janice really clearly showed, even with children of incarcerated parents, the quality of that relationship really does matter. And so we should be doing all we can to improve that quality. And what really seems strong here, particularly with Liz's findings, is that mentors who are trained and have exposure and understand that this isn't just a piece of cake, that it's enormously rewarding, but it requires training and it requires understanding the complexity of the lives you're working with, you can really make a huge difference. And I think that comes very clear with Lindsay's findings, that you take a group that is having kind of adequate relationships but not great, and you've got different effects than ones who come in, young people who come in who have these sort of disrupted relationships. And we get stronger effects for that middle group, but it doesn't mean that the disrupted group could never benefit from mentoring. What it tells us, if you combine it with all the other things that we saw today, is that for someone who's coming in who's got a disrupted relationship with their parents, it's going to require additional training of the mentor who's working with them, understanding what trauma exposure means, and understanding how best to work with them. So that's sort of a summary, but let's open it up now to your reactions and impressions here.
I was just wondering, I work with adolescents in foster care in the mentoring program, and does the age of when they enter into a mentoring relationship make a difference?
And can you repeat the question? The person who it's directed to. Oh, there we go. Okay, because it's live streaming.
Oh, great. I work with youth in foster care 14 to 21, and we have two programs actually in two different counties in southeast Pennsylvania. And one starts with children earlier at the age of 6. My group doesn't start until 14. And I'm wondering if there's a difference in how successful a relationship is if you have a mentor earlier with the youth in foster care, or if the age of intervention makes a difference or not.
Yeah, I don't have direct evidence of this. The sample that I was working with was 9 to 11-year-olds, so that's where where those findings are coming from. I actually think, especially in light of what Liz talked about, that perhaps there are some differences in the age of the child, but it's probably more so to do with the mentor behaviors and mentor skill. That's just my sort of anecdotal response. Yeah.
Does anyone else want to weigh in on findings they have pertaining to age?
Yeah, Katie and Jean and I are working on a paper right now where we've looked at, can you hear it okay? Where we've looked at risk and age as predictors of relationship longevity. And basically cutting across all risk levels, if the child initiates the relationship in adolescence, they're at extremely high risk for premature closure. So that study doesn't look at the factors that might protect against the premature closure, but I would assume that all of the practices that you engage in, including training and ongoing support of the mentor, will probably mitigate that. But they're at really high risk, and I think you have to wrap a lot of services around that match to keep it, to sustain it.
Yes.
all of you in some way, shape, or form have talked a lot about the importance of the mentor, their training, their behaviors, their skills. Are there a few core things that you can highlight in terms of behaviors and skills that we should all keep in mind?
Anybody want to weigh in?
I can start just with this idea that I think has come up a couple times of mentor self-efficacy, and I think it might mean something different for each mentor, but to the extent that supervisors or people who are overseeing cases can be checking in with mentors about their confidence level going into a match, I think that's something we're seeing has an impact, and it's kind of amorphous at this point. I think we need more research going into kind of what exactly that is and what predicts the confidence, but I think that that's coming out is really important.
Can I just add that I think in addition to the mentor efficacy is efficacy at what? And I think lowering expectations about what you need to do to be effective is important. Just putting boots on the ground consistently, I think, is really important. So if mentors have a lower bar for what it means to make an impact in a kid's life, then more mentors can achieve mentor efficacy, I think.
Mm-hmm.
That's a great point.
It is.
I'm going to give a preview of Stella Kent. She was she can't be here. She's a member of our lab who's done some work with Sarah Schwartz and others looking at different mentoring styles and what effects those have on outcomes. And she used something similar to what Lindsay used, this kind of statistical clustering of mentors based on how they approached the relationships, and came up with some pretty distinct groups. And some of them were very focused on improving grades, and we almost called them the tutor group. They were just came in there and they had this pretty high bar, as Michael was talking about. You know, I'm going to change this kid's grades. Another group, we called them sort of the therapy group, and they just wanted to talk, and there was not a lot of action involved. And then we had this, and Michael used the word play. We had what looked like a playful group. There was more of a humor and activity engagement around shared interest. And across the board, that group seemed to be doing better. That just going in with the idea of actively engaging in a relationship without just trying to fix somebody and without being too passive about it seemed to be leading to even better academic outcomes than the tutor group. So that's just a sneak preview, and I guess I slipped it in because I didn't get to present a paper.
I wanted to add that Jean and Katie and Rebecca and I spent about 6 years developing online training for mentors and did this very tight manipulation of a randomized trial. And I think Jean and we're working on the paper now, but one thing that was really interesting is that mentors got training as usual in the control group, and then the intervention group got training as usual plus the online training, which is all based on the research. So we spent years developing it and getting the content right. But the key findings were that we were able to show that mentors who got the online training had more realistic expectations. So they didn't have more negative expectations, but it kind of modulated their positive expectations. They also felt they had tremendously more knowledge about what mentoring was. Just factually, they understood it better, and they felt much more efficacious. They were significantly more efficacious, huge effect size, and they also felt like they actually had a better understanding of the roles that they should play and the roles they shouldn't play. So I advocate for training and pull all the research together. I mean, we love our training, but if you understand what mentors need to know that makes mentoring work, things like having a developmental perspective, having modest expectations, being patient with the process, be playful, be active, engage in collaborative decision-making, share power. So all of those are the things that we infused into our training, and we were able to show that it made a really big difference in how mentors thought about the process.
Can I just... Do you want me to go? Okay.
Go ahead, Lindsay.
Okay.
And then Mike.
I just want to add something that I think is an undercurrent of everything that everyone has mentioned so far is this idea of attunement. And I know Julia Price is here too and has done some great qualitative work. And I have a quantitative study under review right now looking at the level of attunement of mentors for adolescents specifically. But the idea that mentors know how to respond to the cues of youth, I think, is really important. I'll highlight one finding of this study is that mentors who came in with their own agenda about academics, this is intuitive, but came in with their own agenda about academics, those mentees did worse. They were more likely to drop out of school. their grades decrease. They were more truant than even those groups that were more of the misattuned but underfocused. So even erring on the side of underfocusing seemed to have better effects than overfocusing on academics. And now we may have some sleeper effects,
That's
I don't
right.
know, which we'll have to wait 10 years to find out. But I think that's an important undercurrent to anything, whether it's play or developmental approach, that the mentors are really attuned to what it is that the youth is wanting and needing out of the relationship.
And Michael, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think trying to explain the value of play is important. And tomorrow I'm going to give a talk about a framework called the team framework that I've been using. And tomorrow I'll talk about its use in a TV show called Peg Plus Cat. But for me, I've really been thinking a lot about this because, in the Morrow and Stiles study, it wasn't just being developmental and present, and it was using that as a launching pad. And I think for me, the reason that play and conversations about the here and now are important are because they honor and recognize the kid's world, which is right now, right? And the things that are important to the kid. And I think once you respect the kid and they feel valued and they feel like you're willing to give up your world for their world and enter their world, they feel appreciated. And at that point, then they open up and say, what have you got to offer in your world? Because most of my stuff is about the negative effects of activity, problem-focused, right when you land, right at the beginning. But down the road, there's evidence that the kids want to be helped and they want to get introduced to that future world. So I think it's about attunement, and it's about honoring those kids so that they feel, all right, I'll let you in.
Megan, you're next. I just want to mention that following this session is going to be another What the Research Says session specifically focused on relationships. And so I encourage you to attend that as well.
My question actually has to do with the training modality, because we are struggling with how can we provide more training to our mentors when they only have so much time. So have you seen any negative effects of providing some training or even all training online? What would you recommend?
No. I mean, I personally recommend a blended approach, and I think that it pays to get the trainings I've sat in on the manuals that I've coded, and Gina and I wrote about it in the chapter in the handbook on training, is that a lot of people, when you look at what they're actually doing in training, they're really talking about facts. And a lot of that knowledge-based work can go online. You don't need to be in person with somebody to do that, or your policies or your procedures. What you need to do in person is do skills work, where more behavioral, less cognitive. So, get people to practice active listening skills and conversation, and talking about how would you figure out what somebody's interests are, and how do you really listen to, so I think what I would do is a blended approach. I'd get a lot of stuff done online, and then when you bring somebody in person, do in person only what you can uniquely do in person. Okay. That's what I'd recommend in general.
Other questions? Kathy?
I just have a quick one. Michael, you mentioned that you said it's always, you write it down, wrap your matches at the end of a year, and then Janice, you talk about length and strength. So I just wanted to understand the difference here between what you're saying and what you're saying.
Well, so I think the consistency of the mentor is important. Just showing up, even if the kid never talks, is the most important thing that convinces a kid, wow, this person's interested in me. I just feel like the evidence is clear that the kids, in school-based mentoring, which is my focus, half the matches don't continue. And the matches that don't continue are not the kind of kids that you see on the advertisements that bring mentors in. They're the kids who've already experienced losses they couldn't control, who are already most likely to be rejected by adults. And so I think giving them the gift of goodbye and the opportunity to practice a goodbye and to have somebody be honest about what they liked and didn't like about the relationship is one of the most important things a mentor can do. And the longer if you hold on to the myth of multiple years, you lose the opportunity to be careful and protect and empower those kids who've not had this thing that's so important. That's just my opinion. I'd rather mitigate risk than think about the gold standard of these multiple year matches that are only going to go to those kids who already can recruit mentors in their own lives, in my opinion.
I think...
I have a general comment. I'm just honored to be in the same room with David and Michael Karcher and Ms. Rhodes, Dr. Rhodes. I just finished a research dissertation on mentoring, the impact of mentoring on student achievement and behavior. And I used one of your surveys to assess the quality of relationships. And just like you, I was surprised with the findings. One of my variables was absenteeism, and it had no connection, and I was really surprised. But the key indicators, which I was really looking for, was the connectedness. There was a significant connectedness with self-esteem, with and their level of student engagement. And with looking at the academics, it didn't improve their GPA, it didn't improve their results on their standardized tests, but it did improve their school-based testing, which was kind of, like peculiar, as you were saying. But, I can go back and look back at that, and just hearing the different research that you guys are doing, how you're breaking it down, you're breaking the subgroups down. I'm just thinking about like how I could have done that differently. And then there's more research to do. So you give me some enthusiasm to continue the process.
Thank you. Any other comments? Yeah, back there.
I actually found it was a useful predictor. I couldn't understand how in a school-based match, but it was a parent involvement in the program was a useful variable. And I thought the only parent involvement would be when the kid got in trouble. So I don't really understand it.
So parental engagement was one of the questions about whether that was a variable that was tested. But in addition to that, the role or the profile of the individual that was providing ongoing support, whether that was another measure that was tested.
I'm sorry, I missed that second part.
The role or the profile of, there was conversation about the ongoing support, so beyond the training an individual providing ongoing support, whether there was a specific profile of that individual.
Well, that is one of the things I wonder is whether you get more staff support when you have kids who are more difficult and you need more staff support. So the question, that sort of, that's not clear. That's a good moderator that we got to know more about.
I want to just speak quickly back to Kathy's question, because I think it was a really good question about are we advocating for school-based mentoring to be 1 year or multiple years? I think I'd rather turn it on its head. Like, there's a lot of empirical research that suggests that the length of the relationship is related to longer outcomes, but a lot of that research truncates at 1 year. So we know that when we say length of the relationship, right, we're talking about if you get it to at least one academic or one calendar year, you get better outcomes than if it's less than a year. But I think the more critical issue is, what does closure look like?
And also, what is the expectation? So
yeah,
if you expect
meeting the expectation. So I wanted to make sure we were clear about that. Like, I don't think that I didn't want us to leave feeling like we were sending mixed messages about length.
I think back there's
yes. This question is for Dr. Raposa. So I love the study that you did around stress and its relatedness to shorter mentoring relationships. I'm just wondering what led to the idea of the research around stress in general. Was it because of the closures on the behalf of the mentors or the mentees, or was it based on training or getting feedback from those who supervise the matches? I'm trying to figure out what was the basis of wanting to look at stress management.
Yeah. So there were kind of two reasons why I decided to look at that. One is just my background. I come from a clinical psychology background, and so the high stress youth are the ones that I'm typically used to working with, and I'm interested in their outcomes. Another is that there have been a couple of meta-analyses in the research, so these studies that have combined basically all the findings from mentoring trials in the past 2 to 3 decades. And they've started to ask this question of how risk affects the outcomes across all of these studies for youth. And they've come up with really mixed findings. So some have shown this sort of relationship where some stress, but not too much, is really helpful for mentoring outcomes, kind of like what we heard from Lindsay. And then others have shown no relationship between risk and the outcomes in mentoring programs. And so I kind of wanted to look in our sample, which has moderate risk, how are these two things related? And that's where it came from.
And I just want to add something to that. One of the early insights that Liz had when we were talking about this paper was that often in this field we divide environmental risk over here and then personal risk here, and really those two things are very intertwined, and typically it's the environmental risk that triggers the individual risk, and that they're not really separable. And so it was really trying to look at risk in a more holistic way. Okay, I think, well, since the mic is there, and then we'll get you up front.
I just had a question about, particularly around school-based mentoring, and we're looking at what it takes. So what sort of, how do I say this? What sort of research is there, or do you know of? I know it's a little bit off topic from what we're talking about today, but do you have around the necessary relationship to have with the school building for something to be successful? I know we always have these examples of shining success, and people matter, and relationships matter, but
it's a great question. Anybody want to answer that? I can just say this. As a community psychologist, understanding the setting in which an intervention is taking place is vital, and it's often overlooked. And I was able to take a year off from being a professor and work in a school-based mentoring program as a match support specialist. And it was a great year, and so much depended on that front office of the school, and whether or not they were going to let the kid out of class, and what time they were going to let them out, and how much you could inhabit the hallway, and where they put you, and if you got put in a really loud cafeteria, you couldn't even hear what the mentee was saying. And so absolutely, building strong relationships with the school is vitally important, just the same way building strong relationships with the family is vitally important. So.
Can I add that Renee Spencer and I did a never to be published paper that we got a lot of those that looked at some of the activities that the staff did. Because I do think that if you don't have school buy-in and you don't have an advocate or champion in the school, you're a dead duck. But we looked specifically at the staff characteristics that were helpful, and they were especially helpful for girls because once we included these staff characteristics, then their activities effects for young girls emerged that weren't visible before that. But the most important predictor was the relationship between program staff and the front office. Because and it was most effective for girls, and I think it's because those mentors would show up, and if they weren't well received and they didn't feel valued, that seemed to transfer probably to the match in some way. So I think that first contact of a mentor showing up is critical, and so it's about collaborating with schools to make sure it's not just you running the show.
I think we had a question right here.
Quick question. I've really appreciated all the sharing that we have done thus far. It will be very helpful as we go back to do our mentoring programming in New York State through the 4-H program. And we're using a group mentoring approach. And I'm curious to know if anyone has done work in that area and can provide any information on the impact of that approach.
Before we answer that, I have to say, is Gabe here? Gabe Cooperman?
I think he left.
He left. Okay, well, he was here before, and you should seek him out. He just published on the National Mentoring Resource Center a beautiful summary of the latest research on group mentoring. And it's required reading for anybody that's thinking about group mentoring. It's really good. But I can tell you, having reviewed that study, but also many studies, there's not a lot of research in the area. And I don't know if I would just say read that study. It's also posted in the Chronicle as well with commentary. Gabe Coopermink, Kuperminc. Okay, over here.
Hi. Thank you, first of all of you, for all the great research. It makes a huge difference to all of us in the field. But I wanted to comment about the parental involvement, the increase in parental involvement based on mentoring relationships. And I can say that in my program anyway, one of the effects that I've noticed that I did not anticipate was that those kids with mentors, not only does it increase and improve their social standing, but it also gets parents more involved. And I don't know if it's based on guilt or accountability, but I noticed that parents of kids with mentors all of a sudden start showing up at school events, at conferences, and I don't know, also perhaps it's because they start coming to school for other mentoring activities, they get a little more comfortable, but it makes a tremendous difference because all of a sudden not only does this kid have a mentor, but they also have a parent who's involved, and that's a huge effect.
Thank you.
For what it's worth, in this project, the involvement of parents was really helpful in buffering crime for the high school girls, but it was not helpful for the boys. The more parent involvement, the the greater the risk for criminality. So I think that's a function of the parents coming in because the kid's being a problem and it not strengthening the network. I really wonder if, for girls, strengthening the network is more important than for boys, even if it's in the context of coming in for problems. They just, I find the gender differences to really be important for us to consider.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that as a field, we kind of lump, high risk and low risk, and girls and boys, and really the goal for research is to kind of untangle those effects. How does it work for girls versus boys, across different age groups and so forth? So, yeah.
Thank you so much. I really like the idea of how we can use training to support and buffer, to use your word, against some of the risk factors that we're seeing. Taking that a step further, do you have any recommendations for how you can be evaluating mentors coming in beforehand? Are there scales that you would recommend as being part of your application to be looking for those high levels of efficacy or looking for that resilience piece, so that maybe even not to screen them out, but so you're doing more meaningful matches?
By the way, this will be our last question. I can tell there's a little agitation to move on, but let's answer that. I also, before we move on to that, I wanted to say one thing more about parent involvement, and that is a paper that was done by Professor Renee Spencer, a really cool, in-depth, qualitative study of how parents perceive the mentoring relationship. And she's back here if you want to talk about that with her. It's also summarized in the Chronicle. But anyway, what kinds of pre-match screening can you do to find mentors who may need extra support, who may be better kind of referred to a different kind of program, and so forth? Does anybody have anything to suggest?
Well, you've already said the self-efficacy, but Liz mentioned the attitudes towards youth scale. I think that's real important to figure out. Usually it's who's coming in to fix kids because they view them as a problem. You can email me and I can send that scale out to whoever wants it. And then David's got a long mentor efficacy scale, and then there's another one that Nicola and Harris created, an old version that I can...
That's the one we used,
yeah.
For mentors' previous contact with youth in the community, we actually just used a very simple checklist. It was like 8 different things that mentors might have done before that I'm happy to send to you, but you could probably come up with your own that's really relevant for the community that you're in.
We've been working some on measures development, Jean and I, for about 8 years. So we've been working on a measure on expectations, realistic
And
expectations.
Sarah Schwartz as well.
Oh, and Sarah, there you are, yeah. And motivations. And then also for the evaluation study, we have their knowledge, roles they should play, roles they shouldn't play. And then we modified the efficacy scale from David to kind of fit the training to look at efficacy. But, it's very similar. We added a couple items. So
And I'll just put in...
we have that battery we can send you.
Michael's senior author on a paper called The Pygmalion in the Mentoring Program, which I think you're referring to that scale. But mentors who come in with sort of an attitude about youth, like young kids in my community are trouble and they don't want to work hard, they tend to, particularly match with high-risk youth, not do as well. And so kind of just gauging their attitudes is really, really important. We have these implicit biases and sometimes explicit biases against young people. You're not going to be as compassionate and attuned to it. So we'll stop there, but we're going to stick around for other questions you might have. And thank you so much for your really great participation.
That's important, because we think we can improve it. But